So I've got two things that Andy was excited about his presentation. I'm, of course, also excited, but I'm also a bit concerned because now Steve's put a little bit of pressure on me to explain something that, quite frankly, I don't fully understand yet. And secondly, it's the after lunch slot. So I'm hoping that none of you will nod off, but if you feel the need for me to change my cadence, dance around, do something to wake you up, let me know. So I wanted to start with a little bit of background. I came into this topic of sustainable food systems in June of this year. So I'm a relatively new arrival on the scene here at CIAT, but I think we're starting from a very interesting place. My personal transit or trajectory to this point has been working very much on market access and value chains and business models and focusing on how agriculture can perform better in terms of poverty reduction and inclusion of small producers, both men and women, in a variety of contexts. So, I was always focused very much on this idea of how do we build inclusive business relationships. And we thought, well, who should we be building inclusive business relationships with? Well, clearly small producers, but who should be on the other side of the table? So we spent an awful lot of time, several years, I'm sure Ruben can tell you exactly how many years, working very much on this topic, and our target of choice was working with larger companies. So I spent an awful lot of time engaging with supermarkets and with multinational food processors and all of these kind of big players in the global food system, trying to have conversations about how to make their value chains or their supply chains more inclusive. So, I think we had some good advances and we had some good results in that. At one point we had some of our methods and tools picked up by Unilever, and so we were very happy about that. And I was at a workshop with the Ford Foundation in Mexico City, and I remember standing up and talking about this. And unfortunately he's left, but Julio Berdegue was sitting there in the front row. And so Julio said, well, this is wonderful. You're doing some great work. Can you tell me, and there are no such thing as innocence questions from Julio, can you tell me how many farmers, what percentage of the overall farming population is involved in these markets that you're working on? And I said, well, yeah, and we started running the numbers. We came up with between 1% and 2% globally. So here we are working on inclusion. Here we are working with large multinationals. Here we are with a relative level of success, but yet we're not really moving the needle. So from that perspective, I've been changing and reevaluating how we do work, and this is where I'm sort of coming from when we start talking about food systems. So I've titled this talk, Sustainable Food Systems for the Majority. I think one of the things that we really need to change in the work around market access and now food systems is this fetish we have for niches, right? We really like high value, we really like export, we really like differentiated, right? And those are all wonderful factors that can really help a small subset of farmers who happen to be lucky enough to be able to produce and compete and maintain themselves in those spaces. What we miss oftentimes is the majority. And the majority are the people who are not necessarily able to differentiate their product. They're not necessarily organized. They're not necessarily selling into high-value markets. They're probably not exporting. These are the vast majority of farmers, women and men across the globe, who are basically producing the food that most people eat. And when we apply this into the food system end of things and we look at the consumers, this means we need to stop talking about the people who buy their food at supermarkets or the farmer's market or happen to have, go to very high-end restaurants. We need to start talking about wholesale markets. We need to start talking about traders. We need to start talking about distribution. We need to start talking about the small corner stores that exist in most countries. And that is what makes up, and I would say restaurants, small restaurants, even street vendors, that's what makes up the food system for the vast majority of people on this planet. And that's where we need to be focusing. So what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit how we're making that transition here at CIAT. And I would say it's a transition that's ongoing. As I said, I joined started leading this process in June, so I don't have the answers. What I'm going to try to lay out are some of the issues where I think we need to be focusing, and very much open it up for comments not only from Eugenio, who I'm sure will have some great insights, but also from all of you. So if we talk about a food system, someone asked me, what is a food system? Well, it's kind of big and scary. So this is the food system. It's everything and it's nothing, right? But the important thing about the food system as a concept and as a tool for a center like CIAT is it allows us to connect things. It allows us to overcome some of the false dichotomies that science tends to drive us towards, right? We're experts in narrow fields of inquiry. That's what you do a PhD on. We're relatively less effective at linking across those knowledge bases and connecting to others within research centers and beyond to understand things that are complex and clearly multidimensional, like a food system. Yeah? So if we look at this gigantic landscape, I'm not going to go into all the details of this, but the question that I want to try to look at in this presentation is, what should CIAT do about this? Where do we focus? Where do we want to work? Where do we have strengths that we can build on? And where do we have opportunities going forward that we can begin to exploit? As I said, work in progress. Ask me to do this talk in not another 50 years, Ruben, but another 5 or 10, and it'll be much more complete. But nonetheless, this is where I think we're going. So CIAT, if we start with CIAT, what should CIAT do vis-a-vis this complex food system? I think the important point of departure should be, what is CIAT supposed to do in general? CIAT's a research center that has a very clear vision and mission. CIAT is working on basically food provision for the majority of people on the planet, and CIAT is working on sustainability. So anything we do in food systems needs to focus on and benefit the vast majority of producers and consumers with whom we're working, and those are principally the poor. So we need to have a very, very tight focus within food systems on those that are the less well off, okay? So that's the first point. Secondly, we have a clear institutional mandate to work on sustainability. Anything we do in food systems needs to take into account not just the economics, but also the connections to environment, the connections to climate, the connections to issues like genetic diversity. All of these topics need to be taken into account because that's the other part of our mandate. So if we look at these two major areas where CIAT has its clear focus, there's sort of 4 topics that emerge that I think we can look at across the food system. And I mentioned some of them yesterday. I think we should definitely be talking about inclusion. We're still talking about poverty reduction. The issue with inclusion within the food system is more complex, however, than just farm-level poverty reduction. We need to understand a lot better what does inclusion look like, not only at the household level in rural areas, but also in people who work on off-farm income, people who are involved in processing, people who are involved in transport, people who are involved in wholesale, retail, et cetera, people who are involved in food preparation. So inclusion becomes a much broader concept. And when we talk about inclusion, it's a question of how do we develop or support food systems that generate opportunities. Yeah? Too often we look at food systems and the examples we find are of exclusion rather than of inclusion. So how do we drive a dialogue that actually generates opportunities for people who are less well off in these systems? So I think that's one of the first topics we'll be working on. Secondly is this concept of resilience. How do we work and build food systems that are able to bounce back better from shocks? I mentioned these a little bit yesterday, but I think there are different shocks that we need to be thinking about. How do we build food systems that can respond effectively to shocks that are in the short term, which may be price shocks, which may be weather shocks, a flood or a drought, but can also build resilience in the longer term through things like climate change? Yeah? Food systems are complex. They're complex adaptive systems. How do we develop the networks and connections between the actors that allow them to better respond to these challenges? How can they build resilience against changes in demographics and changes in diets? How do we become resilient in that regard as well? So that's a second area where I think CIAT has an awful lot to add. In the first area, perhaps we can build on our market access work. In the second area, there's clear connections with things around climate and other topics. Sustainability. This is part of what we do at CIAT. So how do we begin to work on food systems in ways that actually provide incentives for better or more sustainable land use? How do we provide incentives through food systems for more efficient energy use, for more efficient water use? How do we begin to have a conversation about what that looks like? How do you begin to connect the dots? And then the final topic, which I think is really critical, is this idea of healthy diets. At the end of the day, what's the food system for? Yeah? We heard a lot of comments yesterday from Tom and others that increasingly both producers and the people who consume food at the other end of the system are effectively becoming consumers. So producers are not only producing food, they're also consuming an awful lot of food. And that happens in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. So how can we, as a research center, begin to identify and provide the incentives for people to have access to affordable and acceptable diversity of food that allows them to have better, healthier diets. And this raises a lot of issues that I think bring us back to the question of the connection, for example, to genetic diversity, which I know that you'll be talking about later, so I won't go into that too much. But these are the kind of things. How do we make these connections? How do we get the incentives in place? So when we begin to talk about the food system from these lenses, you know, we see a lot of different things, and this is just some images. So yes, we're still talking about rural families. This is a rural family, clearly, that is no longer the norm. This is a much larger rural family, rural household than we tend to see. But nonetheless, we're still talking about rural communities. So when we talk about food systems, how do food systems connect to transform, transport, and sustain rural communities? How does it work for women? How does it work for men? How does it work for the youth? Does it provide opportunities? Yeah? So that's one of the things we need to think about. Who are the farmers? Andy stole this slide already, but anyway, I'm going to use it again. Who are the farmers? Farmers are changing. You know, farmers are not the same. Farmers are transforming in terms of access to information, access to technology, the way they go about farming. And the role of agriculture within their livelihood is also shifting. We did a study here in Colombia looking at a World Bank project on the Productive Alliances project I mentioned yesterday, where we were able to show that in some cases the investments in cacao or in maize or in dairy or whatever product they were supporting in the Productive Alliance increased 100% or more, yeah? But the needle in terms of household income only moved between 4 and 7%. So what does that tell you about the power or lack thereof of agriculture to transform livelihoods and poverty? And the rationale behind that is principally because we were working with low-income, marginalized communities of color in areas of post-conflict. So these are the communities who have been historically and traditionally marginalized in Colombia. And so agriculture in these contexts proved to be useful but less powerful than in others, because people have, due to risk, have had to diversify their livelihoods. So agriculture is part of the portfolio, but it's not as powerful as we think it once was. So farmers are changing. They're getting older. A lot of people are moving off farm, and they're also moving into higher value crops. So a lot of the small farmers that we're working with are now moving out of basic grains or moving into different crops that may provide better market opportunities for them. In some cases, we're seeing, as we mentioned yesterday, demographic shifts that I think in the midterm will lead to processes of some sort of land consolidation. We just don't have, or we aren't going to have enough rural population to keep farm sizes where they are forever. And I think we're going to start to see processes of consolidation. There was an interesting piece of work out of Africa around the polemic issue of land grabbing. And one of the things that came out of this study was the fact that a lot of the land grabbing was in fact second generation people who'd left the rural areas, moved to the city, done well, and now were buying land. So these are a new generation of farmers, one generation removed from the farm, buying 20 hectares at a pop. So that's a different kind of farmer. And this is what's happening, I think, in a lot of the countries we're working in, and we oftentimes forget it or downplay it because sometimes it's not what we expect to see or want to see. We talked a little bit about this yesterday as well. It's not just farming. Yeah? It's off-farm employment and income. And this in rural communities is becoming increasingly important in the food system. It's certain things, simple things like sorting and processing, or sorting and washing in this case with potatoes. It doesn't have to be rocket science. But these are increasingly becoming apparent in a lot of the communities we work in, and it becomes very, very important to understand in terms of how the food system functions. You know, this is post-farm gate, but we need to understand what happens and what does it mean, who benefits, who can gain access to these kind of jobs, are they good jobs, yeah? And how do they affect things like the water and energy footprint of these systems. Then we've got the missing or the hidden middle. This is one of my favorite. This is my favorite superhero. This is Duckman. So Duckman roams the streets of Hanoi, making the world less safe for ducks, but much safer for those who like to eat ducks. So next time you're sitting down to have a duck in Hanoi, this may be where it came from. But these are kind of the actors that exist in the food system in what Tom called the invisible silent revolution, the quiet revolution. I keep forgetting. You're so quiet, Tom. It's hard for me to.
Middle, quiet revolution.
Right, exactly. But these are the kind of actors that we really, really miss, and we don't necessarily understand. And these are people that we need to build. We need to understand when we look at the food system. What's their role? What are they doing? Who benefits? Who loses? And how are they functioning? There's another superhero from Hanoi that I didn't include in the talk, but he's Barrel Man. And Barrelman drives around with two 55-gallon drums on the back of his motorbike. And you know what Barrelman does? Barrelman goes to all of those restaurants that you find all over Hanoi where it's clear that nobody eats all of their food, and there's obviously quite a bit of food waste. And Barrelman collects that food waste and feeds it to pigs. Yeah? Those are the superheroes that exist in these food systems that we don't know about. Yeah? So where's the food waste? There is no food waste, or there's very little food waste. And then we've got our friends who work in the informal markets. Again, in most of the market work we've done in the past, we've downplayed this. We focus on niche markets because it's easier, because this is really complicated. And how do you get into these markets? And it's a mafia, and nobody will tell you what's going on, and it's unsafe. We need to unpack how these systems work, and we need to unpack how they connect then to food processing and preparation, which is increasingly important for people on the low end of the income spectrum. They oftentimes don't cook at home. In Bogota, it's more common for somebody to have a stereo system in their house than to have a kitchen. Yeah? So what does that tell you in low-income strata? What does that tell you? And so these are the kind of things, street vendors. These are the kind of people in the food system that we just don't know about. So the challenge for CIAT is to get its head around this, to see what role we play, to apply to these different kind of actors the ideas of, and finally the consumer at the end of it, and to apply these concepts. How do you begin to look at the food system through this lens? What are the tools we can use? And then I would say the biggest challenge we have, not just in doing this part, is the following. If we can look at the food system from inclusion, resilience, sustainability, and health to diets, that's fine. But actually what we need to do is this. It all needs to connect. And so this, from a CIAT perspective, is a major challenge. How do you begin to get people collaborating on these issues? So if we talk about resilience, if we're talking about food system resilience, we need to be having a conversation with the people from climate change. Yeah? How climate resilient is a food system? How do you measure that? How resilient is a food system to shocks? How do you measure that? What's the data? Is there a big data assessment tool that you can use to measure resilience? Can we come up with some sort of a composite indicator? That's the challenge. How do you begin to work from not just the food system, but also climate, or also economics and price information, or consumer data? On sustainability, how do we connect the food system work to things like water footprinting, carbon footprinting, energy footprinting? How do we bring that in and put it together? How do we connect it to the issue on healthy diets? We have a colleague, Colin, who's done quite a bit of work on the consolidation of global diets. Really interesting stuff. How do you land that into a food system? How do you get that data available and in front of policymakers in such a way that they can actually understand how diets are shifting and what that means for the system? And then how do you develop the feedback loops between the dietary shifts and the demographic shifts that drive the inclusion, the resilience, and the sustainability of the overall system? So that's the challenge we have here at CIAT. A food system is a complex adaptive system, yeah? And we can't solve or understand a food system from only one discipline. So the challenge here in CIAT and for the broader CG is how do we build those bridges and the incentives to apply multiple lenses in a collaborative fashion to the food system. If we talk about healthy diets, how do we connect to biodiversity, the agrobiodiversity, to the germplasm bank? How do we do that? How do we have a conversation about, do we have the right collection to respond to the nutritional needs going forward of these populations? And then the second challenge, and with this I'll finish, is, I think in general, CIAT and most of the research centers, globally are fairly good at doing assessments. We're good at going out and assessing what the system looks like. We can go out and we can map it, we can do surveys, we can gather data, we can look at big data sources, we can interview lots of people, we can do a lot of different things. So we're fairly good at assessing how the system works. But to actually do something that has any result or any hope of changing things, there are two more steps that we need to get much better at. The second is this idea of engaging with the food system. How do we go from just assessing what's happening in the food system in Cali? Guy Henry can go on about what's happening in the food system in Cali. How do we go beyond assessing to actually engaging people? Who do we engage? How do we start working with actors who we haven't previously worked with? Here it's not national policymakers, it's municipal policymakers. How do you engage with municipal policymakers? How do you engage with these mostly traditional market actors? How do you engage with consumers? How do you have conversations about sustainability and sustainable food systems with these actors? These are very different actors than we typically engage with. And how do you engage in such a way that while you're probably limited in the scope of what you can do through an engagement, a pilot project, how do you actually use that to learn? How do you use that to structure a hypothesis that you can test and that you can then learn from, and then you can use to change behavior. That's the important thing. At the end of the day, we're talking about how to build evidence to change behaviors and practices in food systems. And we're not going to do it ourselves. We're going to be nudging others to do things differently. And finally, how do we leverage this for influence? How do we turn our assessment and our engagement, which is necessarily small and piloted, into a process that actually allows us to punch above our weight? How do we use this to influence? Who do we engage with? Who do we partner with? Yeah? Do we partner with, again, going back to the multinationals who are doing food processing, do we partner with them? Do we partner with civil society? Do we partner with governments? Do we partner with the Rockefeller Foundation? Who do we partner with to actually drive influence? And so CIAT in general is very strong on assessment, and I would say we have a long track record on engagement through participatory methods and whatnot, but we need to get a lot better at influence. How do we translate what we find into influence? And how much of that is our role, and how much of that is a role of partners? And so these are the kind of questions, and the two big questions that I had at the end is, one, how do we break down barriers and work on food systems in all of its complexity across multiple disciplines? That's the first challenge. And the second is, how do we go from just understanding the system to actually influencing or arguing for a better system, a system that actually delivers better diets in a more sustainable, inclusive, and resilient way. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. We'll hand it to Eugenio to follow up. We heard a number of different places. Mark scared us a little bit.
Yeah.
And so hopefully we can add some insight into where these touch points are, how we engage with this otherwise very complex system.
Well, thank you very much. First, I'd like to thank the people and the government of Colombia for the hospitality. Congratulations to CIAT. Schengen Fan asked me specifically to convey the appreciation and congratulations from all IFPRI people. So I'm going to talk about one of the questions in our topic is what needs to happen to build, to have food systems that are inclusive, resilient, environmentally sustainable, and healthy. So I work basically on macroeconomics, trade, and financial issues. So I was thinking what needs to happen on the macro side, on the trade side. And Alberto Valdez was talking today about that in the morning. So I decided more to go to the financial side, drawing on my own experience. Before, I was preparing projects, rural development project for the World Bank, for multilateral development banks in the 80s. Then I was at the board of I was executive director at the board of the Inter-American Development Bank. I was the chairman of the budget and financial policies. I was involved in all the financial engineering to double the lending of the IDB during the crisis, and then the capital increase afterwards. So I decided, well, let's look at the financial issues. And then usually, you need to have a conceptual framework and say, well, you need to go back to basics. So please, I decided to go to a very well-known economist and philosopher, John Lennon, who in the past he very forcefully argued, money, that's what I want. But just to make it more inclusive, I changed to we, what we want. And yeah, we need money because the requirements are in the $1 trillion. And remember, trillion in English is million of millions. In Latin America, we talk billions when it's million of millions. And we could argue that part of the root causes of underdevelopment in Latin America is that $1 trillion in the US gets you only $1 billion in Latin America, but that's a separate discussion. So I decided just to look at, where the money may come from. And thank you. Where the money may come from. And we have 7 options. Development aid, concessional, but that's about, just to give a sense of proportions. The world economy is $74 trillion in current dollars. When I discuss these issues, I like to use current dollars, not PPP dollars, because things are not transacted in PPP dollars. So in current dollars, it's $74 trillion, sorry, see my problem. And the developed countries is about 46, high-income countries and low and medium-income countries are about the difference, 20-something. So we were talking about $2.5 trillion needed to do all the things that are usually related to this SDG 2 expanded and all the things to this healthy food system. So we're talking about perhaps 5%, 10% of the GDP of developing countries. So let's see, to have a sense of dimensions of the money that we need. So first thing, development aid. But that's $160 billion that peaked in 2015. That's about 0.2% of the world GDP, 0.6% of the developing countries' GDP, and cannot be expanded much because of political and budgetary reasons. First point. Second point, multilateral lending, the World Bank, the IDB, African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank. Okay, the net flows, banks are lending, but they are being repaid. So the net flow is $22.8 billion in 2015. That was the peak. So it's at one dimension lower than the point A. So I'm going to talk basically to C, D, unconventional monetary policy. That's not to be discussed here because it's more with the central banks. In the past, the central banks were creating money that were given to agricultural banks to be on lend to the agricultural sector. That's related to money creation, etc. I'm not going to talk about that. I have some of the ideas in the book that I had on macroeconomics, agriculture, and food security, and a paper that's called The Future Ain't What It Used to Be, Growth Models versus History. So there are possibilities there in unconventional monetary policy, but that's too long and for the central banks. And of course, controls of corruption, illegal financial flows, and tax evasion. That's a scandal, but again, it's not for this discussion. So I'm going to focus on C, D, and F. The first thing, okay, let's go to the public sector budgets. If government expenditures in emerging and developing countries, that's the IMF category in this decade, is about $8.5 trillion. That's a reasonable number. Of course, in developed countries, it's $18.8 trillion, but the share of agriculture is only, depending on the regions, between 2 and 6% of the budget. So it's small, and if you look at the agricultural index, orientation index of the FAO, which is what is the percentage that goes to agriculture in the budget compared to the percentage that the agriculture represents in the GDP, you divide both, and you can see that for developing, I have sorry, I'm getting, when I talk and I get excited, so I'm losing my breath. We have the developing average, the developing median, and then we have for the developed countries. You can see that in the case of developed countries, they spend more than the share of the agricultural sector in the share of the budget. In developing countries is far less. So if we move to the same level of the median, developing countries to the developed median, we're almost doubling the level of agricultural expenditure. But that's agriculture alone. The question is that we are not talking about agriculture only. We are talking about an expanded view of SDG 2. So we did some public expenditure review for Honduras and at IFPRI, and we looked at how much they spend on agricultural and value chains, then on rural and regional development, so infrastructure, cities, etc., safety nets, poverty-based safety nets, health and nutrition interventions, and climate change. It adds up on only 2.9, 2.7 of the total GDP of Honduras. You can say, well, is that enough? It's not enough. But I think we need to look more at how much money the governments are putting into these things that we are saying that are very important. And usually the public expenditure reviews look only at a specific sector, agriculture, education, etc. I think we need a more holistic view of the expenditures in the public sector budgets and look at the levels component, then efficiency, efficacy, and equity of those investments, of those expenditures. So let's move to the credit markets. Credit markets, the banking system, if you look at the data, this is from the World Bank, the other one from the IDB, from IMF. The credit to the private sector is about $20.3 trillion in developing countries. But the portion of the agricultural credit, it's only 4.1 of total credit on average and 2.6 the median, if you look at the data from FAO. And again, if you look at the agricultural orientation index, which is the percentage of credit for the agricultural sector divided by the percentage of agriculture in the GDP, we can see again that we have the agricultural sector is receiving far less than the share. You can argue whether is that a good indication of fairness or not. But in any case, it's clear that in developed countries, which is the red lines, they are spending more on agricultural credit or the agricultural sector than developing countries. And if the developing countries move to, let's say, to 1, so the same share of credit as GDP, that would move the level of credit from about $230 billion to $570 billion approximately. So this is the second level. We had a lot of analysis of rural financial markets in the past. I'm just, the Adams, Graham, and von Pirske studies in the 80s, the World Bank 1986. Then there was a work for FAO and GTZ. IFPRI worked on microcredit. And now we have the G20 and the Financial Inclusion Working Group and the Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion. That's very good, nice work, but I think we still need a holistic view of the banking and credit system and understand all the aspects, the macroeconomic and flow of funds, the regulatory aspect, the institutions, instrument delivery modes, and the farmers and small participants in the value chains, behavioral constraints and other constraints. And we're not doing this right now. We need to have a better, more holistic view of in specific countries of the whole credit system and the banking system and why it's not the agricultural sector or all the things that we're saying that need to be done are not being financed. And I'm going to move to the third point, which is, so we looked at fiscal policy, banking policy, and now financial markets and what I call private wealth. There is also wealth in corporations, but I'm looking only at the household wealth. The total wealth, and this is a stock, where we were talking about that we need X amount of trillion as additional investment, that as a flow. So the total household wealth in 2015, this data comes from different sources, $250 trillion. What they call environmental, social, and governance focused investments, the stock of those investments now is about $12.9 trillion. If we go to another level, which is called impact investment, the amount of money, we moved to billions, and the deal flow in 2016 was 22 billion. Another indicator, they are not add up, they are different things, but we have green bonds. The issuance in 2016 was $81 billion. So the point is, we have a lot of liquidity, and the interest rates are very, very low, as you can see. So, and I keep on hearing the same, The vice president of, one of the vice presidents of the IFC, of the World Bank, she was being quoted in a World Economic Forum, there's plenty of liquidity, no projects. So the point is, apparently we have a lot of partnership opportunities, the type of things that Mark was referring to. And we have a lot of potential financing. And then there's a lot of more work on this side. They keep on building funds that perhaps get to here, but they are the level, the minimum level is too high, and who's organizing and helping the producers to be able to get to that funding? So the question that or the issue that we are working with Ruben and with Schengen and colleagues in CIAT, Carolina Navarrete, Ana Maria Lobo Guerrero, we are talking about how we can create a facility that can mobilize. Okay, let's go back to the last slide. We need to have a facility to work with farmers and small value chain operators to structure projects that can be, through some financial engineering institutional design, be able to channel some of this liquidity that exists in the world. Now, all the work is being done on the financial side, but then it never reach the small farmers. And the argument that we are, or the hypothesis that we are working on with the colleagues from CIAT is that CIAT has, with 8,000 scientists in more than 70 countries, working with INEAS, with the governments, with farmers, and so on and so forth, there is a unique possibility to bridge that gap. Not that the CGR ends being a a research organization. CGR needs to be a research organization in order to be able to do this sort of side work that helps bridge that gap. So we are trying to work on that. Hopefully we will get some funding to try this idea at some point. So just summarizing, the question was what needs to happen to construct food systems? I discussed quickly 7 options, and I'm focusing on 3. So we need certainly more work on public expenditure reviews with a focus on expanded SDGs or FNS, for food and nutrition security, to realign priorities and expenditures. Then we need a further review of financial markets to understand exactly what the problems are. I think the work being done is very good, but it's piecemeal, it's small things. We need to have a whole view at the country level. It has to be a multi-country study. And finally, we suggest the possibility of creating this facility to help mobilize CGR knowledge to prepare projects and alternative for partnerships with private investors. Thank you.
So we're up against a pretty challenging set of time limits today, and I think what we heard just now is a really, really important aspect of the sustainable food system, and it's this idea that there's this financial component that is one of the fabrics that lines the entire food systems. Let's call it one of the silver linings. Mark, the way I'm going to do this, I'm just going to ask you to follow up briefly, and then we'll call this particular session to a close. If the financial system is one of these common elements that we really need to pay attention to in order to have this assess, this engage, and this influence, what would be another area to focus? So financial systems being one, what would be your next priority?
Well, if we sort out financial systems, I'd be pretty happy. No, I think the other question that we face, and it's one that I think Andy alluded to in his talk as well, is there's also a question here of information and data flow and increased, what I would say in a very broad sense, increased connectivity along the system. So I think the other issue there is how do we take advantage of some of the opportunities that are emerging in terms of the use of ICTs and the use of data to actually facilitate better, stronger linkages and feedback loops between the actors that are engaged in these systems. And I think we need to really begin to understand how that data piece fits in here, because to understand these systems, to assess them currently, is rather expensive, the way that we go about using traditional approaches. And I think we really need to get better and smarter about using other data approaches or data gathering approaches to understand the dynamics at play here. And then how do you feed that back to the actors to influence behavior? So data and information flow, I would say, is the second one.
And of course, that's highly complementary to the financial component, and there's a fairly substantial area of overlap. With that, I'd like to thank both these gentlemen. Very deep insights, and I think we not only have the context of the sustainable food system, but some very clear touch points for action moving forward from, at the very least, the financial systems perspective, as well as the data perspective. Both are absolutely right in terms of where some of the levers are, and I think as Mark continues to unite the various activities in food systems here at CIAT, we'll start identifying these other levers along with these two that we just discussed. Thanks to both of our expositors.